Welcome, dear listeners, to another journey through time. Today I take you to the mists of Victorian England, where love challenged the rigid conventions of an era in transformation. This is the story of Sophia Whitmore, a young orphan whose destiny was sealed by a marriage contract, but whose heart wrote a narrative far different from the one planned by men. In a time when railways cut through ancestral landscapes and the Industrial Revolution was reshaping the world, there were still places where age-old traditions dictated the course of human lives. Prepare to meet a woman who, despite being treated as a bargaining chip, found the strength to transform her own story. Let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from? Your presence here makes this journey even more special. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps me continue to bring these emotional stories to you. England, 1847, County of Derbyshire. The autumn of 1842 had left invisible scars on the soul of Sophia Whitmore. At 15, the young woman with golden brown hair and eyes as green as the pastures of Yorkshire found herself an orphan, a victim of a cholera epidemic that had devastated the county like a silent, relentless storm. Whitmore Manor, with its rose gardens that her mother had cultivated with such care and the oat fields that rippled in the wind like a golden sea, had become too heavy a burden for the delicate shoulders of a young girl. The country estate, once prosperous under the management of Lord Edmund Whitmore, was withering like a flower without water, and so Sophia found herself in the cold hands of her uncle and aunt, Lord Roderick and Lady Margaret Ashford, in Derbyshire. The Ashford mansion, though imposing in its Georgian architecture, breathed an atmosphere of calculation and coldness that contrasted painfully with the welcoming warmth of her former home. Lady Margaret received her with measured smiles, gestures too precise to be genuine. Her black silk dresses rustled like dry leaves as she walked through the corridors, and her words always carried the weight of a fulfilled obligation, never the relief of an offered embrace. "You understand, dear Sophia," Lady Margaret would murmur during the silent dinners, while the fine porcelain china tinkled under the weight of forced conversations, "that your presence here is a matter of family duty. We expect you to be grateful." Sophia had learned to nod in silence, her small hands folded in her lap like those of a marble statue. In her rooms on the third floor of the house, far from the main halls, she would spend hours contemplating the distant hills through the small window, fogged by time. There, in the silence that had become her refuge, she could still hear the echo of her mother's loving voice reciting verses by Byron, or feel the protective presence of her father adjusting the blanket over her shoulders on cold winter nights. The years passed with the heavy slowness of honey. Sophia blossomed in beauty like a wild rose growing in rocky soil. Her skin acquired the delicate pallor of English porcelain, her hair gained golden highlights that captured the morning light, and her green eyes seemed to hold secrets as deep as lakes amidst the moors. But it was precisely this beauty that sparked an idea in the Ashfords that would forever change the young woman's destiny. The matter was not merely aesthetic. Sophia, at 20, possessed something rarer than beauty. She had a silent dignity, a natural elegance that no formal education could teach. There was something in her posture, in the way she folded her hands, in the delicate manner she held a teacup, that spoke of true aristocratic lineage. It was on a March afternoon in 1847, as the rain drummed against the windows of Lord Roderick's study, that Sophia first heard the name that would change her life forever. "Lord Alexander Pemberton is looking for a wife," Roderick said to his wife, not realizing Sophia was passing in the hallway with a tea tray. "The Duke of Ravenshollow is a man of considerable means." Sophia stopped. Something in her uncle's tone, a certain ill-disguised urgency, made her heart race. "And our financial situation?" Lady Margaret questioned in a tense voice. "Desperate," he admitted in a harsh whisper. "The railway speculations were a disaster. If we don't find a solution soon—" Sophia didn't need to hear the rest. The knot in her stomach already told her everything. On that rainy afternoon, as the grey light of late winter filtered through the red damask curtains, she understood that her life, once again, would be decided by others. What destiny awaited her in the hands of an unknown duke? The spring of 1847 arrived with a sinister urgency at the Ashford house. Sophia could read between the lines of the hurried whispers, the furtive glances exchanged during breakfast, the secret meetings in her uncle's study, that something definitive was being plotted. Lady Margaret began to treat her with an exaggerated, almost theatrical courtesy. She sent for a French dressmaker from London to create new gowns for Sophia, silks in shades of blue that enhanced her eyes, delicate white muslins like petals, dark green velvet that contrasted magnificently with her golden hair. "You must be presentable," Lady Margaret would say, while personally adjusting the ribbons of Sophia's corset. "A young lady of your social standing must always make a good impression." Sophia observed her reflection in the oval mirror in her room. The young woman staring back seemed a stranger, more woman than girl, with a beauty she herself did not fully recognize, but her eyes retained that shadow of melancholy, that depth that spoke of premature losses and solitude cultivated in silence. It was on an April morning, as the daffodils began to bloom in the formal gardens of the Ashfords, that Lord Roderick finally summoned her to his study. The room smelled of cigar smoke and old leather, with its shelves full of bound volumes that no one read anymore, and maps of the colonies tacked to the dark oak walls. "Sophia, my dear niece," he began, avoiding her direct gaze, "the time has come to discuss your future." She remained standing, her hands clasped before her, waiting. The light filtering through the heavy curtains created geometric patterns on the Persian rug. "Lord Alexander Pemberton, Duke of Ravenshollow, has asked for your hand in marriage." The words fell into the air like stones dropped into a silent lake. Sophia felt the world sway slightly, as if the ground beneath her feet had given way by a few inches. I do not know him, sir," she murmured, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Acquaintances are made in matrimony," Roderick replied with dry pragmatism. "Lord Pemberton is a man of 45, a widower, owner of extensive lands in Northumberland. He is considered one of the best matches in England." Sophia swallowed hard. 45 years old. She was 20, a difference that seemed an insurmountable abyss. "And if I preferred to remain unmarried," she ventured, her voice almost a whisper. Roderick's short, harsh laugh echoed through the room. "My dear child, women like you do not have the luxury of choosing, especially orphan women with no dowry of their own." The crudeness of these words struck Sophia like a cold slap. She understood in that instant that she was nothing more than an element in a financial equation, a piece in a chess game played by men who measured value in pounds sterling and landed properties. "The wedding will take place in September," Roderick continued, shuffling papers on his desk as if discussing the sale of cattle. "Lord Pemberton has already sent the bridal dowry, a considerable sum." Sophia closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had changed in her expression. A resigned acceptance, perhaps, but also a quiet determination that her uncle and aunt failed to interpret. "May I be excused?" she asked in a controlled voice. "Of course. And Sophia," Roderick stopped her as she was heading for the door, "I hope you understand that we have done this for your own good. Lord Pemberton can offer you a future that we could never provide." Sophia nodded once, an almost imperceptible dip of her head, and left. In her rooms, she sat by the window and gazed at the gardens where spring was exploding in color. For the first time in years, she cried, not for the losses of the past, but for the uncertain future that was approaching, like a storm on the horizon. What kind of man was this Duke of Ravenshollow? And would she have the strength to face another life decided by others? Alexander Pemberton, Duke of Ravenshollow, watched London from his window in the elegant Belgrave Square townhouse. The capital was buzzing with the excitement of the 1847 spring social season, but he remained on the fringes of all this worldly activity, like a distant observer of a play that no longer sparked his interest. At 45, Alexander was a man who carried the weight of responsibilities inherited far too early. His imposing physique, over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders that perfectly filled the bespoke coats from his Savile Row tailors, dark brown hair only slightly silvered at the temples, still drew admiring whispers in the salons of high society, but his grey-brown eyes maintained a melancholic distance that discouraged more intimate approaches. The dukedom had fallen into his hands 15 years earlier, when he was just 30, after his father's premature death in a hunting accident. With it came the extensive properties in Northumberland, the coal mines in the north of England, investments in railways spreading like spiderwebs across the country, and the responsibility for hundreds of families who depended on the Pemberton lands for their survival. Alexander managed all of this with cool, distant competence. He was respected in London's financial circles, feared for his business acumen, admired for his moral integrity in an age when corruption was rampant among many aristocrats. But he was also known for his almost pathological reserve, his tendency to decline social invitations, and his reputation as an impossible man to win over. His first marriage had been a matter of dynastic duty, arranged by his father when Alexander was 28. Lady Evelyn Harrington possessed all the qualities required of a duchess: impeccable lineage, a considerable dowry, a refined education, and conventional beauty. The marriage lasted for 5 years, proper but passionless, until a carriage accident on an icy winter road put an end to that formal union. Alexander had never allowed himself to truly love Lady Evelyn, nor she him. They were two polite strangers who shared a house and a title, nothing more. When she died, he felt more relief than grief, a confession he would never make to a living soul, but one that tormented him on sleepless nights at Pemberton Hall. It was his solicitor, Sir Reginald Morrison, who first suggested a second marriage. "Your Grace needs an heir," he had argued on a rainy afternoon in his London office. "The dukedom of Ravenshollow cannot die with you." Alexander had spent hours contemplating this observation. At 45, he felt too tired for matrimonial games, too old to court young debutantes, but too conscious of his dynastic responsibilities to ignore the need to continue the line. When Lord Roderick Ashford approached Sir Morrison with the marriage proposal involving his orphaned niece, Alexander was initially skeptical. Arranged marriages with much younger women often resulted in unhappy unions for both parties. But when Sir Morrison described Sophia Whitmore to him, an orphan of good family, educated, beautiful, but without exaggerated social pretensions, a young woman who would not have unrealistic romantic expectations, Alexander considered the possibility more seriously. He was not looking for love. That youthful illusion had been buried along with his first wife. He was merely seeking a suitable companion, someone who could be a mother to his children and perform the role of duchess with dignity. One evening, in his private library at Pemberton Hall, surrounded by the thousands of volumes that were his only true companions, Alexander made his decision. He sent a formal letter to the Ashfords accepting the match and setting the financial terms. He did not know, as he sealed that correspondence with red wax marked with his ducal signet, that he was about to find something he had long considered impossible: a second chance at true happiness. But the human heart is unexplored territory, even to its own owners, and Alexander Pemberton was about to discover emotional continents he never suspected existed in his systematically organized soul. September of 1847 arrived with a golden melancholy that seemed to perfectly match Sophia's state of mind. The leaves of the ancient oaks around St. Mary's Church began their slow autumnal transformation, as if nature itself were preparing a farewell. The small parish church in Derbyshire, built of grey stone in the 14th century, silently awaited the ceremony that would unite two strange lives into a single existence. Its Gothic stained-glass windows filtered the morning light into coloured fragments that danced on the polished oak pews. Sophia had spent the last week in preparations that felt more like funereal rites. Lady Margaret orchestrated every detail with military precision. The white silk gown, trimmed with tiny pearls, arrived from London in boxes lined with tissue paper. The Brussels lace veil had belonged to the Ashfords' grandmother. The jewels, an emerald necklace and matching earrings, were a loan from Lady Margaret herself. On the morning of the wedding, Sophia stood for a long time before the oval mirror in her room. The reflected young woman seemed a stranger. The white silk accentuated the pallor of her skin. The pearls created a luminous frame around her face. The veil transformed her into an ethereal, almost ghostly figure. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her French lace gloves. She had still not met the man she was to marry in person. There was only a daguerreotype, a formal portrait where Lord Alexander appeared austere and distant, his features marked by a seriousness that seemed carved from marble. The Ashford carriage took her to the church on a journey that felt both eternal and all too fleeting. Sophia watched the familiar landscapes of Derbyshire through the window, the green fields dotted with sheep, the carefully trimmed hedges, the thatched roof cottages, as if seeing them for the last time. Outside the church, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered. Ducal weddings were rare events in the region, and everyone wanted a glimpse of the young woman who would become the Duchess of Ravenshollow. When the carriage stopped, Sophia took a deep breath. Lord Roderick stepped down first and offered her his arm with exaggerated ceremony. "Courage, my dear," he murmured as they walked toward the church's Gothic portal. "You are about to become one of the most powerful women in England." Power. The word sounded strange to Sophia's ears. She had never desired power, only a true home, sincere affection, perhaps someone with whom to share life's small pleasures, as she had with her parents in her golden childhood in Yorkshire. The interior of the church was filled with the local aristocracy. Sophia recognized a few faces from the rare social occasions she had attended with the Ashfords, but most were strangers, whose curious gazes assessed her as if she were an exotic piece in an exhibition. And then she saw him. Lord Alexander Pemberton was waiting by the altar, imposing in his black ceremonial coat, gold-embroidered waistcoat, and impeccably tied white cravat. He was taller and more impressive than Sophia had imagined from the daguerreotype, with a bearing that commanded silent respect. His dark brown hair was well-groomed, his angular face possessed a mature, masculine beauty, and when his eyes met hers, Sophia felt an inexplicable shiver. It wasn't fear, at least not just fear. There was something in those grey-brown eyes that suggested hidden depths, perhaps even a carefully guarded kindness. The walk down the central aisle seemed to last an eternity. Each step on the time-worn stones echoed like a heartbeat. Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the altar, trying to control the trembling of her legs. When she reached Alexander, he inclined his head in a respectful bow. There was courtesy in his gestures, but also a reserve that mirrored Sophia's own shyness. The Reverend Dr. Harrison conducted the ceremony with traditional solemnity. The words of the Anglican liturgy echoed in the Gothic nave like ancient, familiar music. Sophia repeated her marriage vows in a low but clear voice, her words mingling with Alexander's in a promise they both made more out of duty than choice. When it came time to exchange the rings, Alexander gently took Sophia's left hand. His hands were large and warm, and his unexpected gentleness made her heart pound. The ring, a gold band with small diamonds, slid perfectly onto her finger. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend announced. Alexander hesitated for a moment, his eyes meeting Sophia's in a silent question. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. He leaned in and touched his lips to hers, a chaste, respectful kiss, but one that left Sophia with a strange sense of anticipation. When they parted, she was officially the Duchess of Ravenshollow. Outside the church, the bells rang in a joyful peal that contrasted with the storm of emotions in Sophia's heart. As the guests congratulated them and threw rose petals over them, she wondered what kind of life awaited her in the distant lands of Northumberland. Would it be just a more luxurious gilded cage? Or was there perhaps a possibility of true happiness? The 3-day journey to Northumberland was a revelation of landscapes Sophia had never imagined existed. As the ducal carriage travelled north, the gentle hills of Derbyshire gave way to dramatic cliffs, wild moors, and a vastness that made the heart both race and shrink with intimidation. Alexander travelled in the same carriage, but maintained a respectful distance. They conversed politely about the scenery, the history of the regions they passed through, the books she had read, discovering to the surprise of both a shared appreciation for Byron and Wordsworth. But there was always an invisible barrier between them, as if they both knew they were still strangers united by a contract, not by choice. When they finally caught sight of Pemberton Hall on the 3rd day, Sophia could not contain a gasp of astonishment. The mansion rose majestically against the grey northern sky, like a palace from a dark fairy tale. It was a Georgian construction of monumental proportions, 3 stories of pale stone, dozens of perfectly arched windows, a facade that stretched for more than 200 yards. Side towers crowned the ends of the main building, and formal gardens spread out before the house in precise geometric designs. "It's breathtaking," Sophia murmured, her voice revealing a mix of admiration and apprehension. "It will be your home now," Alexander replied, watching her with curiosity. "I hope you will feel comfortable here." Comfortable. The word seemed too small to describe the feeling of being about to inhabit a place that looked more like a monument than a residence. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, where a marble staircase led up to double oak doors adorned with gilded carvings. A line of servants waited to receive the new Duchess, more people than Sophia had seen together since the wedding. Alexander stepped down first and offered her his hand. As Sophia's feet touched the gravel of the main entrance, she felt as if she was stepping into a world completely different from the one she was born into. The head butler, an elderly man with a severe but not unkind appearance, bowed deeply. "Welcome to Pemberton Hall, Your Grace. I am Higgins, butler of the house for 35 years, Your Grace." Sophia was still getting used to the title, the curtsies, the formality that now surrounded every moment of her existence. The interior of the house was even more impressive than the facade. The entrance hall soared to a ceiling, painted with mythological scenes, illuminated by a crystal chandelier the size of a small room. Curved marble staircases ascended to the upper floors like the open wings of a swan. "Would you like to see your chambers?" Alexander offered with formal courtesy. Sophia nodded, following him up the main staircases. Her footsteps echoed on the marble, creating a ghostly music that seemed to accompany her ascent into a world of incomprehensible luxury. The Duchess's apartments occupied an entire wing of the second floor. Alexander opened the double mahogany doors and stepped aside for her to enter first. Sophia could not suppress a whisper of admiration. The suite consisted of a private sitting room with a marble fireplace, a study with shelves full of books, a dressing room larger than her old room at the Ashfords, and a master bedroom dominated by a four-poster bed with sky-blue silk curtains. Enormous windows offered a view of the gardens, and beyond them, the moors stretching to the horizon. "They are beautiful," Sophia whispered, approaching one of the windows. "They belong to my first wife," Alexander said, his voice taking on a more distant tone. "But they are yours now. You may make any changes you wish." Sophia turned to face him. It was the first time he had mentioned the late Duchess, and there was something in his expression that suggested carefully guarded memories. "They are perfect as they are," she replied softly. "I do not wish to change them." Alexander studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher some mystery in her words. "Very well. I will leave you to settle in. Dinner will be served at 8, if that suits you. Until then, you are free to explore the house. Higgins or any of the servants can guide you." He headed for the door but paused before leaving. "Sophia," he said, using her first name for the first time since the wedding, "I want you to know that I will respect your boundaries. This marriage need not be rushed in its intimacies. We have time to get to know one another properly." The words were spoken with such unexpected kindness that Sophia felt tears sting her eyes. She had spent her wedding night terrified of what to expect, based on the whispered conversations she had overheard among the married maids. "Thank you," she murmured. "That means a great deal to me." When Alexander left, Sophia sank into a velvet armchair by the window. For the first time since learning of her marital fate, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Perhaps this man, this stranger who was now her husband, was kinder than circumstances had allowed him to reveal. Outside, the moors of Northumberland stretched under a darkening sky, and Sophia wondered what other surprises awaited in this new life that was just beginning to unveil its mysteries. The following weeks passed in a delicate dance of mutual discovery. Alexander kept his word, respecting Sophia's space with a gentleness she had not expected to find in an arranged marriage. They shared meals, walks in the gardens, and polite conversations in the library, but always maintained a respectful distance that allowed them both to gradually get used to the other's presence. Sophia discovered that Pemberton Hall was more than a residence. It was a complete universe. There were over 200 rooms, each with its own personality and history. The library housed a collection of more than 15,000 volumes, some rare manuscripts dating back to the 13th century. The stables were home to purebred Arabian horses, with names like Starlight and Moonbeam. The formal gardens, designed by the famous Capability Brown in the previous century, were true works of living art. But what impressed Sophia most was the extent of the Pemberton lands. During her morning walks, she began to understand the magnitude of the responsibilities Alexander carried. There were tenant farms where dozens of families lived, fields of crops that stretched for miles, flocks of sheep that dotted the hills like clouds come down to earth. One October morning, Alexander invited her to accompany him on a tour of the properties. They rode side by side, Sophia on a gentle mare named Luna, Alexander on an imposing black stallion, through landscapes that looked like paintings by Constable. "My grandfather built most of the cottages you see there," Alexander explained, pointing to a cluster of stone houses with slate roofs. "We have always believed that prosperous tenants make for prosperous estates." Sophia observed the well-tended vegetable gardens, the children playing in the yards, the women hanging laundry on lines. There was something peaceful and orderly about that rural life that touched her deeply. "It's an enormous responsibility," she commented. "And a privilege," Alexander replied, looking at her with renewed interest. "Few people understand that. Many aristocrats see their lands merely as a source of income. To me, they are human beings entrusted to my care." It was the first time Sophia had glimpsed the true nature of the man she had married. Beneath the ducal formality, there was someone who took his responsibilities seriously, who genuinely cared about the well-being of others. In the evenings in the library, they began to have more intimate conversations. Alexander would tell her stories of the Pemberton family, show her ancestral portraits, explain the traditions that governed ducal life. Sophia, in turn, spoke of her childhood in Yorkshire, of the parents she had loved deeply, of the books that comforted her during the difficult years with the Ashfords. On a stormy November night, as rain lashed against the library windows and the flames in the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the bookshelves, Alexander asked a question that subtly changed the dynamic between them. "Sophia, do you feel lonely here?" The question caught her off guard. She was sitting in a leather armchair by the fire, a volume of Keats's poetry open in her lap. Alexander occupied the neighboring armchair, a glass of brandy in hand, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Sometimes," she admitted honestly, "but less than I expected. And you? Did you feel lonely here before, not before me?" Alexander was silent for a long time, contemplating the fire. "Always," he said finally. "This house is magnificent, but it can be terribly lonely, especially during the long northern winters." There was a vulnerability in his voice that Sophia had never heard before. She closed the book and watched him with renewed attention. "Tell me about your first wife." Alexander hesitated, as if carefully weighing his words. "Evelyn was a suitable woman," he said at last. "She fulfilled her duties as a duchess perfectly. But we were never truly close. It was an arrangement, like ours, but one that never evolved into something deeper." "Does that sadden you?" Sophia asked softly. "It saddens me to know that two people can live under the same roof for years and remain essentially strangers to one another. I hope that," he looked directly into her eyes, "that our fate will be different." For the first time since the wedding, Sophia felt something more than resignation or politeness. There was a sincerity in Alexander's voice, a careful hope that echoed her own secret feelings. "I hope so too," she murmured. That night, when Sophia retired to her chambers, she took with her the strange feeling that something had shifted between them. A door had been opened a crack, revealing possibilities that neither of them had dared to contemplate during the first months of their marriage. Was it possible that an arranged marriage could turn into something truly meaningful, or was it just an illusion created by shared loneliness and circumstantial kindness? The future held its own answers, but for the first time, Sophia allowed herself to hope. December came to Northumberland with the ferocity typical of northern winters. Snowstorms followed one another without respite, transforming the gardens of Pemberton Hall into a world of crystalline purity and sepulchral silence. The roads became impassable for days, isolating the mansion from the rest of the world like an enchanted castle in a fairy tale. For Sophia, this forced isolation proved to be an unexpected gift. Without social obligations, without courtesy calls, without the formalities that governed ducal life, she and Alexander were compelled to get to know each other more intimately. They developed an almost domestic routine: breakfast together in the small morning room, morning rides when the weather permitted, afternoons in the library reading or talking, intimate dinners followed by evenings by the fireplace. It was a simpler life than Sophia had imagined possible in a ducal residence. It was on a particularly stormy night, when the wind howled through the towers of Pemberton Hall like a wild beast, that the final barrier between them began to crumble. Sophia was in the winter parlour, her favourite room in the house, with its 17th-century French tapestries and panoramic view of the snow-covered gardens. A monumental fireplace warmed the room, and she had settled into a burgundy velvet armchair, embroidering a handkerchief with golden threads. Alexander appeared at the door, hesitant. "May I join you? The wind is too dreadful to be alone in the library." "Of course," Sophia replied, indicating the armchair next to hers. "The fire is particularly welcoming tonight." He sat down with a sigh of contentment, stretching his legs toward the flames. For the first time since they had met, he seemed truly relaxed, his hair slightly disheveled, his cravat loosened, a casual intimacy that humanized him. "Sophia," he said suddenly without preamble, "do you miss your old life?" The question surprised her with its unusual directness. Alexander usually approached personal subjects more obliquely. "Part of it," she admitted honestly. "I miss the simplicity of Yorkshire, the freedom to walk through the fields without ceremony, but I don't miss the loneliness I felt at the Ashfords' house. They didn't treat you well." It wasn't a question, but a statement. Sophia lowered her embroidery to her lap. "They weren't cruel exactly, just indifferent. I was an obligation to them, nothing more. I never felt truly cherished in that house." Alexander watched her in silence for a long time. "And here? Do you feel cherished here?" The question carried a vulnerability she had never heard in his voice. Sophia looked at him directly. "More than I expected," she replied carefully. "You have been incredibly kind to me, Alexander. More than I had any right to expect in an arranged marriage. An arranged marriage, he repeated with a slightly bitter smile. That's what we are, isn't it? Two strangers united by convenience and legal contracts. That's what we were, Sophia corrected gently. But perhaps we can become something different. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Sophia's heart race. Do you truly believe that? I believe that two people of goodwill can choose to build mutual affection, she answered, choosing her words carefully. I believe that kindness begets kindness, that respect can evolve into something deeper. And would you like it to? His voice was almost a whisper. Sophia felt a blush rise up her neck. It was the most intimate conversation they had ever had, and every word seemed laden with meanings they did not yet dare to name explicitly. Yes, she murmured almost inaudibly. I would. Alexander stood up abruptly and walked to the window, watching the storm outside. When he spoke again, it was without turning around. My first marriage was a complete emotional failure, he said in a controlled voice. Evelyn and I never managed to truly connect. We lived like polite guests in each other's house. When she died, I felt guilty for being unable to mourn her loss. Sophia remained silent, understanding that he needed to speak, to exorcise ghosts long kept in silence. I swore to myself that I would not try again, he continued, that I would only remarry out of duty with no expectation of personal happiness. But then you arrived, and he finally turned to face her. And I discovered that I am still capable of hoping, of wanting something more than mere convenience. The words hung in the air between them, like a delicate bridge waiting to be crossed. Sophia stood up and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. Then let us hope together, she said simply, and see what we can build. Alexander held out his hand to her. Sophia took it without hesitation. For the first time, they did not feel like a duke and duchess playing social roles, but like Alexander and Sophia, two souls who had decided to try to find each other through the storm. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the warm parlor, something new and fragile had been born between them. Was it love? It was still too early to use that word, but it was, without a doubt, the seed of something that could blossom into true love if tended with patience and mutual care. January of 1848 brought with it the most anticipated tradition of the Pemberton social calendar, the Grand Winter Ball at Pemberton Hall. It was an event that brought together the aristocracy of 3 counties, a celebration that Alexander maintained out of family obligation, but which he secretly considered an ordeal to be endured. This year, however, there was a new development that transformed everything: the official presentation of Sophia as the Duchess of Ravenshollow to broader society. The preparations took weeks. Pemberton Hall was transformed into an even more magnificent version of itself. The main ballroom, with its bohemian crystal chandeliers and Venetian mirrors, was polished until it shone like a jewel. The winter gardens were decorated with tropical orchids brought from the special greenhouses. The kitchen worked for days, preparing a feast worthy of royalty. Sophia faced the prospect of the ball with a mixture of excitement and terror. It would be her first significant public appearance as Duchess, and she knew she would be scrutinized, evaluated, and judged by the unforgiving standards of English high society. Lady Pemberton, Alexander's unmarried aunt, who lived in a separate wing of the mansion, took personal charge of Sophia's preparation for the event. Lady Catherine Pemberton was a woman of 70, elegant and sharp-witted, who had been one of London's greatest beauties in her youth and still maintained a formidable presence. "My dear," she said one afternoon, while personally adjusting Sophia's ball gown, "you must understand that this ball is more than a party. It is your informal coronation as the new Lady of Pemberton Hall." The gown had been created especially for the occasion by Madame Delacroix, the most sought-after dressmaker in London. It was a work of art in midnight blue velvet, embroidered with hundreds of silver beads that created patterns of constellations. The neckline was elegant but modest. The fitted sleeves accentuated the delicacy of Sophia's arms, and the full skirt moved like water when she walked. To complete the ensemble, Alexander gifted her the Pemberton sapphires, a necklace, earrings, and a tiara that had been among the ducal treasures for 3 generations. When Sophia looked at herself in the mirror on the night of the ball, she barely recognized the young woman who stared back. There was a natural grandeur about her that the months as a duchess had cultivated, a quiet confidence that contrasted dramatically with the terrified girl who had married just 4 months before. Alexander was waiting for her at the top of the main staircase, impeccable in a black tailcoat, white waistcoat, and the blue sash of the Order of the Garter across his chest. When he saw her descending the marble steps, his expression of formal politeness transformed into something much more intimate. "You are stunning," he murmured, offering her his arm. "I'm nervous," Sophia confessed in a low voice. "You needn't be. You were born for this," he replied, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he truly thought so. The ballroom at Pemberton Hall had been transformed into a fairy tale vision. More than 300 guests mingled among the pink marble columns, their jewels sparkling under the light of 1,000 candles. The orchestra, brought especially from London, occupied a raised gallery and played the most elegant waltzes of the Viennese repertoire. The entrance of Alexander and Sophia was announced by a footman in a solemn voice. "Their Graces, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow." A respectful silence fell over the ballroom as all eyes turned to the ducal couple. Sophia felt the weight of those gazes like a physical pressure, but Alexander's steady presence by her side gave her the strength to maintain her composure. They descended the curved staircase into the hall, receiving compliments and curtsies from their guests. Sophia was introduced to dozens of people, lords and ladies whose titles dated back centuries, foreign diplomats, high-ranking military officers, businessmen ennobled by the crown. But it was during the third waltz of the evening that the true moment of magic occurred. Alexander extended his hand with perfect formality. "Duchess, would you grant me the honor of this waltz?" Sophia accepted with a graceful curtsy, and they moved to the center of the ballroom. The orchestra struck up the first bars of a Strauss waltz, and Alexander led her in a dance that seemed to float over the polished marble floor. It was the first time they had danced together, and Sophia discovered that Alexander was an exceptional dancer. His movements were fluid, confident, guiding her with a gentleness that turned the dance into an intimate conversation expressed through movement. As they swirled around the room, Sophia felt the rest of the world disappear. There was only the music, the warmth of Alexander's hand on her waist, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the universe. "You have brought light to this house," he whispered in her ear during a particularly close turn. "Light to my life." The words were spoken so softly that only she could hear them, but they carried an emotional weight that made Sophia's heart race. For the first time, Alexander was not speaking like a duke fulfilling social duties, but as a man expressing true feelings. "Alexander," she began, but he spun her again, and the intimate moment was lost in the waltz's choreography. When the music ended, they remained still in the center of the ballroom for a moment longer than etiquette recommended, lost in each other's eyes. It was only when the applause of the guests brought them back to reality that they parted, both slightly breathless. The rest of the night passed in a succession of dances, conversations, and ceremonies, but Sophia held that moment from the waltz like a secret treasure. Something had changed between them in that golden ballroom, under the lights of 1,000 candles and to the sound of Viennese music. When the last guest departed in the early hours of the morning, and Pemberton Hall returned to silence, Sophia knew she was no longer the same woman who had descended those stairs hours earlier. She was falling in love with her own husband, and from the way Alexander had looked at her during the waltz, she suspected the feelings were mutual. The question now was, would they have the courage to confess these nascent feelings, or would they continue to dance around them with the same elegance with which they had danced that unforgettable waltz? The days following the ball passed in an atmosphere charged with unexpressed anticipation. Sophia and Alexander continued their established routines, shared meals, walks when the weather permitted, evenings in the library. But there was something new in the air between them, an electric current that made every casual encounter significant, every silence pregnant with possibility. Sophia found herself watching Alexander with renewed attention, the way his long, elegant hands held a book, how his eyes lit up when he discussed a poem that touched him, the respectful manner in which he treated every servant in the house. She was discovering qualities in him that went far beyond the superficial courtesies of a well-bred gentleman. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be rediscovering Sophia through a completely new lens. He noticed how she moved through the house with growing naturalness, how she interacted with genuine kindness with the staff, how her laugh, still rare but gradually more frequent, transformed any room. It was on a stormy January night, when the wind lashed against the windows of Pemberton Hall with savage fury, that fate forced the confrontation they both had been unconsciously avoiding. Sophia awoke suddenly from a recurring nightmare that had tormented her since her parents' death. Fragmented images of the cholera epidemic, beloved faces disfigured by the disease, the sickly smell that had permeated Whitmore Manor in those terrible days. She was trembling and bathed in a cold sweat, her heart pounding with nocturnal terror. She tried to go back to sleep, but each time she closed her eyes, the visions returned with renewed intensity. Finally, she gave up. She wrapped herself in a French silk robe and left her apartments, needing fresh air and perhaps a cup of hot tea to calm her nerves. The west tower of Pemberton Hall housed a small, intimate parlour that Sophia had discovered during her solitary explorations of the house. It had a smaller fireplace, a few comfortable armchairs, and a panoramic view of the moors that stretched to the horizon. It was her secret refuge when she needed true solitude. She had just lit the fire in the fireplace and settled into an armchair when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Her heart quickened. Who would be awake at this hour of the night? Alexander appeared at the door, also in a robe, his hair slightly disheveled from sleep. He seemed as surprised to find her as she was to see him. "Sophia? Is everything all right?" There was genuine concern in his voice, not mere formal courtesy. "Nightmares," she admitted simply, without elaborating. Alexander hesitated for a moment at the door, as if weighing the propriety of entering a space where she had obviously sought privacy. May I stay? Or would you prefer to be alone?" "Stay, please," she replied, surprising herself with her own answer. "The storm makes everything feel more haunted." Alexander sat in the adjacent armchair, maintaining a respectful distance but offering his presence as comfort. "Do you want to talk about the nightmares?" Sophia contemplated the dancing flames in the fireplace for a long time before answering. "About my parents, about how I lost them. The cholera epidemic was terrible. They died in a matter of days, and I could do nothing but watch." "How old were you?" 15. Alexander was silent for a long time, absorbing the magnitude of the loss she had suffered so young. "I'm so sorry," he said finally, and there was so much genuine feeling in his voice that Sophia felt tears sting her eyes. "They loved me so much," she whispered. I was truly cherished in that house. Since then, I have never felt that way again until—" She stopped abruptly, realizing what she had almost said. "Until when?" Alexander encouraged gently. Sophia looked at him, and something in his expression, a vulnerability that mirrored her own, encouraged her to be completely honest. "Until now. Until you." The words hung in the air between them like a sacred confession. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Sophia," his voice was hoarse with restrained emotion, "you have changed my life completely. When you arrived, this house was just a magnificent collection of empty rooms. Now it is a true home." He stood and walked to the window, watching the storm outside, but Sophia could see his reflection in the glass, the tension in his shoulders. "I thought I had lost the ability to feel anything real for a woman," he continued. "My first marriage was so sterile, so lifeless, that I believed that was how all aristocratic marriages were meant to be. But you—" He turned to face her. "You have taught me that I was wrong." Sophia stood as well, approaching him with hesitant steps. "Alexander, You have taught me that it is possible to truly love," he interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "That it is possible to find a soulmate even in an arranged marriage, if two people open themselves to that possibility." "Are you saying you love me?" Sophia asked, her voice almost inaudible. Alexander held out his hands to her, which she took without hesitation. "I am saying that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love any human being," he declared, with an intensity that made her tremble. "I am saying that you have become my reason for waking in the morning, my last thought before I fall asleep. I am saying that you have transformed a marriage of convenience into the greatest happiness of my life." Sophia felt tears roll down her face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love your kindness, your integrity, the way you care for the people under your charge. I love how you have made me feel cherished again, how you have given me a true home." Alexander gently pulled her into his arms, and for the first time she allowed herself to melt completely against his chest. He smelled of shaving lotion and the masculine scent that was uniquely his. "May I kiss you?" he asked with reverence. "Truly kiss you, not as a marital obligation, but as a man who loves a woman." In response, Sophia lifted her face to his. The kiss was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not the chaste kiss at the altar, but an expression of true passion, tender yet intense, that spoke of months of growing feelings finally released. When they parted, They remained in an embrace by the window, watching the storm outside. But inside the small, warm parlor, a different storm had passed. The storm of nascent passion which swept away the last vestiges of formality between them. From that night on, they would no longer be just the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow playing social roles. They would be Alexander and Sophia, husband and wife in the truest and deepest sense of those words. Love had finally found its way to Pemberton Hall, transforming an arranged marriage into a true love story that defied all the conventions of the era. March came to Northumberland with promises of spring that manifested in small daily miracles. The first daffodils bravely peeking through the lingering snow in the gardens, the more cheerful song of birds returning from their migrations, slightly longer days that whispered hopes of renewal. For Sophia and Alexander, the changing of the seasons perfectly mirrored the transformation of their hearts. Since that stormy night in the West Tower, when they finally confessed their mutual love, they had allowed themselves to dive into the delicate exploration of this nascent passion. It was Alexander who suggested the trip to Pemberton Villa in the Lake District. "We need a place where we can just be ourselves," he said one morning over breakfast, as they gazed at the gardens beginning to awaken from their winter slumber. Away from ducal protocol, away from social obligations. A place where we can discover who we really are when no one else is watching. Pemberton Villa was a smaller property the family maintained in Cumberland, on the shores of Lake Windermere. Built in the romantic style of the previous century, it was an elegant but intimate country house, surrounded by English gardens and with a panoramic view of the serene waters that reflected the surrounding mountains like a perfect mirror. The journey there was a revelation in itself. Traveling in a simpler carriage with only a few essential servants, Sophia and Alexander discovered an informality that their ducal lives rarely permitted. They talked freely about everything: books, music, philosophy, dreams for the future, childhood memories. Alexander revealed his secret love for astronomy, showing her constellations during an overnight stop at a cozy inn. Sophia confessed her long-suppressed desire to paint landscapes, a talent her parents had encouraged, but that she had abandoned during the difficult years with the Ashfords. Pemberton Villa welcomed them with the elegant simplicity that Sophia had come to associate with true refinement. The rooms were smaller but cozier than those at Pemberton Hall. The windows offered stunning views of the lake, and there was an atmosphere of a romantic retreat that turned every moment into an intimate discovery. There, far from the prying eyes of society and the formal duties of the dukedom, Sophia and Alexander blossomed as individuals and as a couple. They spent entire mornings walking the trails that wound around the lake, afternoons reading together in a wisteria-covered pergola, and evenings talking by the fire about dreams they had never dared to share with anyone else. It was on one of those nights, when a March storm battered the windows of the villa and they were warming themselves by the fire in the master bedroom, that Sophia finally found the courage to take the definitive step that would transform their marriage from a union of hearts into a true union of souls and bodies. She had retired to change after dinner, returning to the master bedroom wearing only a pearl-colored French silk nightgown, her golden hair loose over her shoulders like a cascade of light. Alexander was standing by the fireplace, still formally dressed, but he had removed his jacket and loosened his cravat in an informality that made him more accessible, more human. When he saw her, his eyes widened with surprise and something deeper, a respectful but unequivocal desire. "Sophia!" His voice was hoarse. She walked toward him with deliberate yet delicate steps, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. When she stopped before him, she raised her hands to touch his face, feeling the slightly rough texture of his well-trimmed beard. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling only slightly with the magnitude of what she was offering. "I want to be truly your wife, Alexander. In every sense." Alexander covered her hands with his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her tremble. "Are you sure? There is no rush, my love. We can wait until you feel completely—" Sophia silenced him by placing a finger on his lips. "I am sure," she affirmed with growing conviction. "I love you. I trust you. I desire you, and I know you desire me too." It was true. Sophia could see it in the way his eyes darkened when he looked at her, in the way his breath hitched when she came close, in the reverence with which he touched her hands during their moments of casual affection. Alexander kissed her then, but not the gentle, controlled kiss of their early days. This was a kiss that spoke of months of restrained desire, of passion cultivated in silence, of a love that had grown from respectful affection to a deep and true need. His hands delicately explored her contours through the fine silk of the nightgown, each touch a silent question, answered by her sigh or the way she pressed closer against him. "May I continue, my love?" he asked in a hoarse voice, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closed as if in prayer. The question revealed everything about the man she had learned to love. Even at the height of passion, Alexander maintained absolute respect for her, ensuring that every step was truly desired. "Please, yes," Sophia murmured, her own hands beginning to explore the buttons of his shirt. "I love you, Alexander. I want to belong to you completely." What followed was an intimate dance of mutual discovery, led by tenderness and illuminated by true love. Alexander guided her with infinite patience through each new moment, his hands and lips worshipping her as if she were something sacred and precious. When they finally came together completely, Sophia understood she was experiencing something many women of her time would never know, the physical consummation of a genuine love, where pleasure and tenderness combined in a symphony of sensations that touched not just the body, but the soul. Later, lying intertwined by the softly crackling fire, Sophia resting her head on Alexander's chest as he stroked her hair, they both knew they had crossed an invisible but definitive line. They were no longer two people who had learned to love each other despite an arranged marriage. They were now truly one flesh, one soul, united not only by marriage vows, but by the conscious choice to give themselves completely to one another. The storm outside continued throughout the night, but inside the warm room of Pemberton Villa, Sophia and Alexander discovered an intimate paradise that no social convention had planned, but that their true love had made possible. When they woke the next day, entwined in the golden morning light filtering through the linen curtains, they knew their true honeymoon had finally begun. Not the formal ceremony that society had witnessed, but the real union of two souls who had chosen to love each other against all odds and expectations of their time. The return to London in May of 1848 should have been a quiet triumph. Sophia and Alexander returned from the Lake District transformed, radiating the serene happiness of a truly united couple. Their weeks at Pemberton Villa had solidified not only their mutual love, but also an intellectual and emotional partnership that transcended the conventional expectations of aristocratic marriage. But Alexander held a secret that not even Sophia suspected, a radical decision that was about to shock the entire social structure of Victorian England. The 1848 London social season was in full swing. Grosvenor Square bustled with elegant carriages, the salons of high society filled every night with balls and receptions, and European politics, with revolutions breaking out in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, provided lively conversation among the English aristocracy, who congratulated themselves on living in a more stable nation. Alexander had agreed to attend the prestigious annual ball of the Duke and Duchess of Westminster, an event that brought together the cream of English aristocracy in a celebration of power, tradition, and wealth that defined the social parameters of the era. Sophia, still adjusting to her role as the Duchess of Ravenshollow in London's highest circles, prepared meticulously for the occasion. She chose a ball gown of golden satin that highlighted her hair and perfectly complemented the Pemberton family emeralds. She was radiant, carrying herself with the serene confidence of a woman truly loved. Westminster Palace was resplendent that May evening. The main ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers reflecting in gilded mirrors, held more than 500 guests, including members of the royal family, government ministers, foreign ambassadors, and virtually all of England's hereditary aristocracy. Sophia and Alexander moved through the salons with the natural elegance of those born to that world, greeting acquaintances, engaging in conversations about international politics, and admiring the magnificent jewels that adorned the ladies of society. It was during the interval between dinner and the ball that Alexander made the announcement that would change everything. He called for the assembly's attention by gently tapping a crystal glass with a silver spoon. The murmur of conversations gradually subsided, until a respectful silence fell over the golden hall. "My lords and ladies," Alexander began in the clear, controlled voice that everyone knew, "I ask for a few moments of your attention for a personal announcement of considerable importance." Sophia watched him with growing curiosity. Alexander had not mentioned any intention of making a public statement. His eyes met hers across the room, and she saw in them a determination that made her sense something extraordinary was about to happen. "As you know, my wife, Duchess Sophia, and I were married last September," Alexander continued, his voice echoing perfectly in the silent hall. What you may not know is that this marriage has become one of the great joys of my life, a partnership that transcends all my expectations of what matrimony could be. A murmur of interest rippled through the assembly. Public declarations of marital affection were rare in Victorian society, especially from aristocrats known for their reserve. It is for this reason that I have an important decision to announce. Alexander paused, allowing the silence to deepen. As of today, I will be transferring half of all my properties, investments and landed titles directly to my wife, granting her complete financial independence and legal control over her own assets. The silence that followed was so absolute that one could hear the crackling of the candles in the chandeliers. Then, like a wave breaking against a seawall, a murmur of shock and disbelief swept through the hall. Sophia felt as if the floor had moved beneath her feet. She knew Alexander loved her deeply, but she had never expected a gesture of such magnitude, a gesture that violated every patriarchal tradition of the Victorian era. In the England of 1848, married women had no legal rights to property. Everything they owned before marriage automatically passed to the control of their husbands. What Alexander was doing was legally possible, but socially unthinkable. Furthermore, Alexander continued, completely ignoring the rising murmur of shock, my wife will have veto power over all major decisions related to the Pemberton estates. She will be my full partner, not only in marriage, but in the administration of our family assets. Lord Reginald Worthington, one of the most conservative aristocrats present, was the first to find his voice. Pemberton, you cannot be serious. This is a fundamental break with the traditions that govern our society. I am completely serious, Alexander replied with unshakable calm. I believe a woman of my wife's intelligence and character should have legal control over her own life and future. Lady Margaret Ashford, Sophia's aunt, turned visibly pale. The Earl of Ashford whispered something urgently in her ear, their faces mirroring the horror many felt at this rupture with established norms. But Pemberton, protested the Duke of Manchester, this sets a dangerous precedent. If all aristocrats begin to, other aristocrats are free to make their own decisions. Alexander interrupted. This is mine. Sophia remained motionless, aware that hundreds of eyes were fixed on her, assessing, judging, trying to understand what kind of diabolical influence she could have exerted over Alexander to drive him to such a radical decision. Alexander walked to her through the crowd, which parted respectfully but with expressions ranging from scandal to frank disapproval. My dear, he said, offering her his arm, I hope you approve of this decision. I did not have the opportunity to consult you beforehand, but I felt it was something I had to do. Sophia looked at him, seeing in him not just the man she loved, but someone brave enough to challenge an entire system in the name of love and justice. I approve completely, she replied, her voice clear enough to be heard by the nearest guests, and I am deeply honored by your trust in me. The rest of the evening passed in a tense atmosphere. A few guests approached to congratulate them, mostly progressive intellectuals and some younger aristocrats, but the majority kept a cold distance, and Sophia could feel the weight of disapproving glances and scandalized whispers. During the journey back to Belgrave Square, Sophia finally found the words to express the magnitude of what Alexander had done. Do you realize you have scandalized half of the English aristocracy tonight? I realize it perfectly, Alexander answered serenely, and I do not regret it in the slightest. But why? Why risk your social reputation in this way? Alexander took her hands in his. Because I love you more than any social tradition, he said with profound simplicity. Because I believe that a woman like you should have control over her own destiny. And because I want the world to know that our union is a true partnership, not a subjugation disguised as marriage. Sophia felt tears of emotion stream down her cheeks. She had married a man who was willing to defy an entire society for his principles and for the love he felt for her. The scandal would reverberate for months in the drawing rooms of London, in the society pages, in the correspondence between aristocratic families. Some would call Alexander a madman, others dangerously progressive. But to Sophia, he would always be the man brave enough to redefine what marital love could mean, even if it cost him the approval of his entire social class. That night, as London whispered about the Pemberton scandal, Sophia and Alexander knew they had crossed another important threshold in their journey together, not just as lovers, but as quiet revolutionaries in a society that resisted change. The autumn of 1848 arrived at Pemberton Hall laden with golden expectations. The ancient trees surrounding the estate dressed themselves in amber and crimson, creating a frame of melancholic beauty that seemed especially appropriate for the moment of transformation Sophia and Alexander were experiencing. The news had arrived on an October morning when Dr. Whitmore, a respected man of science brought specially from London, confirmed what Sophia had suspected for a few weeks. She was expecting a child. Alexander received the news with a joy that transcended any expression Sophia had ever seen on his face. When the doctor left, he wrapped her in his arms with a reverent gentleness, as if she had become something even more precious than she already was. "A child," he murmured into her golden hair. "Our own child." Sophia felt a happiness she had not thought possible. After a life marked by premature loss and uprootedness, the prospect of creating a family of her own, founded on true love, seemed a miracle she had hardly dared to dream of. The following months were a period of exquisite care. Alexander hired not only the best doctor in London, but also an experienced midwife who had attended births in some of England's noblest families. Sophia was surrounded by attention she had never expected, not just from the servants, who treated her with growing devotion, but especially from Alexander, who became an even more attentive and protective husband. He spent hours talking with her about their plans for the child, about how they wanted to raise them, about the values they hoped to instill. They decided that regardless of gender, the child would be educated not only in the privileges of the aristocracy, but also in the responsibility that came with those privileges. "I want our child to understand that social position means service to others," Alexander would say during one of their evening walks in the Winter Gardens. "That wealth is an instrument for doing good, not just for personal satisfaction." Sophia agreed completely. Her own experience as an orphan, dependent on the charity of others, had taught her the importance of compassion and true generosity. As her pregnancy progressed, Sophia discovered a new side of Alexander that touched her deeply. He read to her every night, not just literature but also texts on child-rearing, progressive pedagogical theories, even medical treatises on maternal care. He was preparing for fatherhood with the same meticulous seriousness he applied to all aspects of his life. It was during these months of anticipation that Sophia also discovered her own strength. The pregnancy, far from making her feel fragile, awakened in her a new and powerful confidence. She began to take more active roles in the management of the Pemberton estates, making use of the legal rights Alexander had so scandalously granted her at the Westminster Ball. To the surprise of many, and even to her own surprise, Sophia proved to be an exceptional administrator. She had a natural intuition for financial matters and an empathetic ability to understand the needs of the tenants and workers on the estates. Her suggestions for improving the living conditions of the families dependent on the Pembertons were not only humane but also economically sound. Alexander watched these developments with growing pride. His decision to make her a true partner in the family's affairs was proving to be not just a matter of principle, but also a significant practical advantage. The birth came on a March night in 1849, preceded by a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Alexander remained in the corridor outside Sophia's chambers the entire time, pacing back and forth like a caged lion, scorning all the social conventions that dictated aristocratic husbands should keep their distance during childbirth. When he finally heard the strong, healthy cry of a child, followed by the midwife's jubilant announcement, "A boy, Your Grace, a strong and healthy heir," Alexander nearly collapsed with relief. Sophia was exhausted but radiant when he was finally allowed into the room. She held in her arms a small but perfectly formed baby, with a crown of light brown hair and the intense blue eyes characteristic of newborns. "Our son," Sophia whispered, holding the child out to Alexander with reverence. Alexander took the baby with hands trembling slightly with emotion. He was a man who had commanded vast estates, negotiated with London's most powerful financiers, held conversations with government ministers. But holding his own son for the first time, he felt humbled and terrified by the magnitude of the responsibility. "Edmund Alexander Pemberton," he announced, using the name they had chosen in honor of Sophia's late father. "May he be worthy of the names he carries." Against all aristocratic traditions of the time, which dictated that noble fathers should maintain a respectful distance from their young children, Alexander proved to be completely devoted to little Edmund. He participated in his baths, held him for hours when he cried, even changed his nappies when necessary, to the horror and astonishment of the more traditional servants. "Your Grace should not," The hired wet nurse would try to protest. "I am his father," Alexander would reply simply. "There is no task related to my son that I consider beneath me." Sophia watched these displays of active fatherhood with growing love. Alexander was not just fulfilling paternal duties, he was genuinely in love with his son, fascinated by every expression, every sound, every small development. Edmund's arrival completed the transformation of Pemberton Hall. The house, which for so long had echoed with dignified but lonely silences, now resonated with the music of a true family life, a baby's cries, whispered loving conversations, shared laughter between a husband and wife who had also become a father and mother. One evening, when Edmund was about 2 months old, Sophia found Alexander standing by the cradle in the nursery, just watching the child sleep. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. "I'm thinking that I never imagined it was possible to be this happy," he replied, slipping his arm around her waist. "An arranged marriage, a wife I barely knew, and now I have a real family, a home filled with love, a future worth building." Sophia snuggled against him, also watching their son sleeping peacefully. "Our little miracle," she murmured, "living proof that love can blossom even in the most unlikely circumstances." Edmund stirred in his cradle, as if dreaming, and they both smiled. There, in that room warmed by the soft candlelight, Sophia and Alexander knew they had found something rare and precious, a family happiness built on the solid foundations of true love, mutual respect, and a commitment to shared values. Little Edmund was not just the heir to the dukedom of Ravenshollow. He was the living symbol of a union that had transcended all expectations, transforming a social contract into one of the truest love stories of its generation. The year 1850 brought with it the consolidation of a happiness Sophia had never imagined possible. Little Edmund, now a year old, had transformed into a vibrant and curious child who filled Pemberton Hall with his crystalline laughter and his first wobbly steps through the marble corridors. But it was during a quiet conversation on a golden September afternoon that Alexander presented Sophia with the surprise that would crown all the demonstrations of love he had ever offered her. They were sitting on the south terrace of the mansion, watching Edmund play with colored wooden blocks on a rug spread across the lawn. The little boy had inherited Sophia's golden brown hair and Alexander's contemplative grey eyes, creating a beautiful combination that made the servants sigh with adoration whenever they passed him. "Sophia," Alexander said suddenly, his voice filled with a carefully contained emotion, "there is something I would like to show you." He removed a sealed legal document from the inner pocket of his coat, extending it to her with solemn ceremony. Sophia unfolded the parchment with growing curiosity. As she read, her eyes widened with disbelief and then filled with tears of deep emotion. It was the deed of ownership for a house and lands in Yorkshire, specifically a property called Whitmore Cottage, located just a few miles from the site of her childhood home, Whitmore Manor. "Alexander," her voice failed her. "I purchased it and had it completely restored," he explained, moving his chair closer to hers. "I want you to have a place where you can connect with your roots, where Edmund can get to know the land his mother came from, a refuge where we can just be a family, away from ducal protocols." Sophia continued to read the document, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. The property description included English rose gardens, an apple orchard, fields that stretched to the familiar Yorkshire hills, and a direct view of the valley where she had spent the happiest years of her childhood. "You did this for me?" "I did it for us," Alexander corrected gently. "I realized that despite all the grandeur of Pemberton Hall, you sometimes get a distant look in your eyes when you gaze at the gardens, as if you are searching for something you lost long ago. I hope Whitmore Cottage can give you back at least a part of what the years took from you." Edmund chose that moment to stand up unsteadily and walk toward them, his legs still uncertain but determined. Alexander automatically scooped him up, and the boy nestled against his father's shoulder with the complete trust of a child who had never doubted his parents' love. "When can we see it?" Sophia asked, still absorbing the magnitude of the gift. "Tomorrow, if you wish. I have had everything prepared for our arrival." The journey to Yorkshire was an emotional pilgrimage for Sophia. As the carriage rolled along the familiar roads of her youth, she felt as if she were traveling through time, reconnecting with the girl she had been before the losses and sorrows that had shaped her life. When they finally caught sight of Whitmore Cottage, Sophia could not contain a gasp of wonder. Alexander had transformed a modest property into a perfect version of her ideal home. Not imposing like Pemberton Hall, but elegant in its simplicity, with gardens that sang in harmony with the surrounding landscape. The house was built of pale Yorkshire stone, with generous windows that captured the golden light of the hills. English rose gardens created a sea of colour that perfumed the air with fragrances that instantly took Sophia back to memories of her mother cultivating similar flowers at Whitmore Manor. The interior had been decorated with exquisite sensitivity. Alexander had managed to create an atmosphere that honoured aristocratic tradition, but with a welcoming intimacy that made every room an invitation to relax. There was a smaller but carefully curated library, a parlour with a piano where Sophia could resume her music, a nursery prepared especially for Edmund, and, the touch that moved her most, a north-facing studio where she could take up the painting she had abandoned years before. "How did you know?" she asked, gazing at the easels and paints carefully arranged in the studio. "You once mentioned that you painted in your youth," Alexander replied. "I thought you might want to explore that talent again." On that first afternoon at Whitmore Cottage, while Edmund napped in a portable cradle and Alexander read in an armchair by the main parlour window, Sophia sat at the piano and played for the first time in years. Her hands automatically found the keys to a Mozart sonata her mother had taught her, and the music flowed through the house like a blessing. Alexander looked up from his book, watching her with an expression of deep contentment. "This is the Sophia I imagined when I first saw you at the altar," he said when she finished playing. "Not the Duchess fulfilling social duties, but the real woman, in all her complexity and beauty." Whitmore Cottage became the family's spiritual refuge. They spent weeks there during the summers, periods when they could live more simply and naturally. Edmund learned to walk in the fragrant gardens, Sophia resumed painting with renewed passion, and Alexander discovered the pleasure of working with his own hands in the garden. There, far from the weight of ducal responsibilities, they were simply a family that had chosen to love each other. Alexander played with Edmund in the orchard. Sophia painted landscapes that captured the serene beauty of Yorkshire, and in the evenings they sat by the fire in the main parlour, planning the future and telling stories they would one day tell the children yet to come. One September evening, as the first leaves began their autumnal transformation and the air carried the sweet smell of the last hay of the season, Sophia and Alexander walked through the gardens of Whitmore Cottage after putting Edmund to bed. "You have given me everything," Sophia said, stopping to gaze at the familiar view of the hills where she had run as a child. "A true home, a true love, a future worth living. And now this, a piece of my past, restored and made part of our present." Alexander wrapped his arms around her, both of them contemplating the golden land that stretched before them. "You have given me more," he replied. "You gave me a reason to be not just a duke fulfilling hereditary obligations, but a man building a life that has true meaning." That night, under the Yorkshire stars that had witnessed Sophia's lonely childhood, they knew they had found something rarer than wealth or social position. They had found a true home, built on the solid foundations of genuine love and mutual respect. Whitmore Cottage was not just an additional property in the vast Pemberton domains. It was the tangible symbol of a union that had transcended all the limitations of its arranged origin, becoming a love story that defied all the conventions of its time. And there, in that blessed piece of Yorkshire, Sophia finally knew she had found what she had lost years before, a place where she was truly cherished, truly at home, truly happy. 5 years had passed since that September morning, when a terrified young woman had walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Church to marry a stranger. Now, on a golden September afternoon in 1852, Sophia gazed at the gardens of Whitmore Cottage, her heart overflowing with a happiness she had never imagined possible. Edmund, now 3, ran through the rose beds with the inexhaustible energy of childhood, chasing butterflies with laughter that echoed like music through the fragrant air. His golden hair shone in the sun, and his personality already revealed the intellectual curiosity inherited from Alexander, combined with Sophia's artistic sensibility. Seated in a wicker chair under the wisteria-covered pergola, Sophia held 1-year-old Catherine Elena Pemberton in her arms. She had been born on a spring morning, surrounded by the same careful love that had marked Edmund's arrival. The little girl had Sophia's green eyes and Alexander's dark brown hair, but her personality was already uniquely her own, more contemplative than Edmund, with an adorable tendency to observe the world with profound seriousness. Alexander emerged from the house just then, carrying a tray of tea and homemade biscuits prepared by the local cook they had hired for Whitmore Cottage. At 47, He retained the aristocratic bearing that had always characterized him, but there was a lightness in his movements, a softness in his expression that spoke of a man truly at peace with himself. "How are my 3 favorite ladies?" he asked, placing the tray on a small wrought-iron table and leaning in to kiss Sophia's forehead, then Catherine's. "Edmund has found a caterpillar," Sophia reported with amusement. "He's trying to convince it to become a butterfly immediately." Alexander laughed, watching his son with paternal adoration. "He has inherited your impatience, my love, and the intensity with which you devote yourself to everything you consider important." It was true. Edmund showed early signs of the determined personality that characterized both his parents. When he wanted something, be it the attention of a butterfly or a second helping of pudding, he applied all his considerable willpower to the task. Catherine, meanwhile, remained nestled in Sophia's arms, her green eyes observing the world with the same quiet contemplation Sophia had shown in her own youth. She was a child who seemed to absorb everything, storing impressions in some secret mental archive. "There's something I need to tell you," Alexander said, his voice taking on the more serious tone he used for important matters. Sophia knew him well enough to recognize that this was something significant. "What is it?" Alexander sat in the chair beside her, holding out his hands to take Catherine, who went into his arms with the complete trust of a child who had never doubted her father's love. "I received a letter from London yesterday. Lord Ashford, your uncle, passed away last week." Sophia felt a pang of complex emotion. Roderick Ashford had not been cruel to her exactly, but neither had he been loving. He was a man who measured relationships in terms of social convenience and financial advantage. "I'm sorry," she said, and she was sincere. Even if there had been no true affection between them, he had been family. "There's more," Alexander continued carefully. "He left Ashford House to you, entirely. Lady Margaret received a smaller property in Bath, but the main estate is now yours." Sophia remained silent for a long time, absorbing the implications. Ashford House represented the loneliest period of her life, the years when she had been treated as an inconvenient obligation. "He left a letter for you," Alexander said, retrieving a sealed envelope from his waistcoat pocket. "Perhaps it will explain his motives." Sophia opened the letter with slightly trembling hands. Roderick's handwriting was familiar, but the message surprised her completely. "My dear Sophia, if you are reading this, then I have departed to meet my Maker and account for a life that was not always conducted with the kindness that should have characterized a true Christian. I want you to know that I have observed your marriage with growing interest over these years. What began as a solution to our financial difficulties has proven to be one of the happiest unions I have ever witnessed in the English aristocracy. I leave Ashford House to you not as compensation for years of coldness, though I acknowledge that my wife and I did not offer you the affection a young orphan deserved, but because I believe you will know how to turn it into a true home, just as you have transformed Pemberton Hall. You have become an extraordinary woman, Sophia. Your parents would be immensely proud. With belated but sincere affection, Uncle Roderick." Sophia felt unexpected tears sting her eyes. It was an apology disguised as an inheritance, a late acknowledgement of her humanity. "What do you intend to do with the property?" Alexander asked gently. Sophia contemplated the question for a few moments, watching Edmund, who had sat down on the grass and was now examining a flower with scientific seriousness. "Turn it into a school," she said finally. "A school for orphan girls, where they can learn not just embroidery and French, but also mathematics, literature, even estate management, where they are treated as human beings with their own potential, not as burdens to be borne until someone accepts them in marriage." Alexander studied her with renewed admiration. That would be revolutionary, a truly equal education for young women. "It would be just," Sophia corrected. "Every girl deserves the chance to discover her own worth, her own strength, to learn that she can be more than just someone's wife, if she so chooses." Edmund chose that moment to run to them, the flower carefully preserved in his small hands. "Mama, this flower is for you," he announced with solemn gravity, "because you are pretty like it, but better, because you give me hugs." Sophia accepted the flower with a reverence appropriate to the magnitude of the gift. "Thank you, my love. It is the most beautiful flower I have ever received." Alexander watched the exchange with the tender smile he reserved for intimate family moments. "Do you know what impresses me most?" he said, after Edmund had run back to his botanical explorations. "How you transformed from a terrified young woman into one of the strongest women I know. How you found not only personal happiness, but also a purpose that transcends our own family. Sophia adjusted Catherine in her arms, the little girl now dozing peacefully under the filtered light of the pergola's leaves. "You gave me that strength," she replied, "or rather you helped me discover that I always had it. When someone truly loves us, we find the courage to become who we truly are." A soft breeze swept through the gardens, carrying the fragrance of roses and the distant scent of freshly cut hay. It was the smell of domestic peace, of hard-won stability, of a happiness that had grown organically from mutual respect and patient care. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Sophia murmured, contemplating the familiar view of the Yorkshire hills stretching beyond the gardens. "That the terrified young woman who walked down the aisle 5 years ago has become this life, this family, this happiness that seems too solid to be real." "It is real," Alexander assured her, reaching out his free hand to touch hers. "And it is lasting. We built this together, Sophia. Brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. No one can take from us what we have created with our own hands and hearts." Edmund came running back, this time carrying a caterpillar carefully cupped in his palms. "Papa, when will it be a butterfly? I've waited a long time." Alexander laughed, rising to kneel at his son's level. "The best transformations take time, my boy. This caterpillar needs to weave its cocoon, to rest, to grow on the inside. Only then can it emerge as something completely new and beautiful. Like you and Mama?" Edmund asked with the disconcerting insight of children. Sophia and Alexander exchanged a look of surprise and amusement. It was a more fitting analogy than Edmund could possibly understand. "Exactly like your mother and I," Alexander agreed. "Sometimes the most important changes happen slowly, when we are not paying attention. And then one day we wake up and discover we have become something much better than we were before." At that moment, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, and the golden afternoon light created a halo around their gathered family, Sophia felt a gratitude so profound it was almost a physical ache. She had begun this journey as an orphaned girl with no choices, treated as a piece in a chess game played by powerful men. Now she was a woman with her own property, a truly loved wife, a devoted mother, a person with a purpose that extended far beyond her own happiness. And all of it had grown from an arranged marriage that neither of them had initially wanted. "Do you know what the greatest miracle is?" Alexander said, as if reading her thoughts. "It's not that we fell in love despite the circumstances. It's that we choose, day after day, to keep falling in love. We choose to build something real from something artificial. We choose to turn a contract into a sacred commitment." Sophia nodded, understanding perfectly. Love had not been the starting point of their marriage, but it had become its destination. And perhaps that made it even more precious. It was a conscious, deliberate love, cultivated with care and intention. As the shadows lengthened across the fragrant gardens, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sophia knew she had found something rarer than wealth, social position, or even fleeting happiness. She had found a true home, not just a physical place, but a sense of belonging that grew from shared love, common values, and the daily decision to choose each other again. And as Catherine slept in her arms, and Edmund chased fireflies that were beginning to blink in the flower beds, Sophia and Alexander knew they had written a story that would defy time. A love story that had grown not in spite of its unlikely origins, but because of the determination of two good people to create something beautiful together. The night fell gently over Whitmore Cottage, enveloping the Pemberton family in the golden peace of a love that had found its way through all social conventions, all expectations, all the limitations of its time, to blossom into a happiness that was both unexpected and completely deserved. Sometimes the greatest happiness is born not from our plans, but from the courage to embrace the unexpected and transform it into something beautiful.